Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this month's Enrichment Series webinar. I'm your host, Amir Ganad, and I'm here together with our presenter, Paul Smith, a managing director at Storymakers LLC. And Paul's got a powerful message about effective leadership and the role that storytelling really plays in leadership. So Paul Smith is one of the world's leading experts in business storytelling. He is one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers of 2018, a storytelling coach, and best-selling author of the books The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, Sell with a Story, Lead with a Story, and Parenting with a Story. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School, and he is a former consultant at Accenture, a former executive and 20-year veteran of the Procter & Gamble company. And his website is leadwithastory.com, and we'll share more information on that as well. So, Paul, thanks for being here. We're really great to have you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to pass the ball over to Paul so he can go ahead and share with us his presentation. Go ahead, you got it.
All right, that looks like that's working. Thanks for the coaching on the technology earlier. Yeah, and thanks for that introduction. I'll give the rest of you my my P&G background. Like Amir said, I spent 20 years at P&G from 1993 to 2013. No doubt I crossed paths with many of you. I spent the first third of that time in finance, the last 2/3 of those 20 years in CMK. And I worked in a number of GBUs. I worked in hair care and baby care, the North America MDO. I spent time on the Walmart sales team, the Costco sales team, and even a manufacturing plant in Modesto, California. So hello to all of those of you that I've worked with before and those that I haven't. So I am going to obviously talk about storytelling today. Let me get right into that and talk about why the topic, the specific topic we're going to talk about today, which is what are the most important stories for leaders to tell. And I wanted to share that because it's something I've been thinking about an awful lot lately. And in fact, my most recent book is all about what stories you should tell. And that's a little bit of a departure since most of the research and writing that I've done since I've left P&G has been about how to craft better stories yourself to make you a better leader, a better salesperson, better marketer, better parent. And as I looked back over those first 3 sets of projects that led to books in this area, if I counted up, and I did, there were 70 different types of stories that I shared with people through my readership about the types of stories that they might want to be telling as a leader, salesperson, marketer, parent, etc. And I think I counted up over 250 different examples across all those books. So I could very clearly be accused of being a little bit too thorough and maybe not focusing enough, because I would constantly get questions like, okay, gosh, Paul, that's a lot of stories. What are the most important ones? You know, and I'm sure I gave a different answer every time somebody asked that question. And so it finally occurred to me, you know, I really should provide some focus. And I happened to have an opportunity because I had a publisher contact me and basically asked me the same question. They said, look, we'd love to publish a book by you about storytelling, but we only work on books that are designed to be read in 1 hour, as opposed to a normal size book that it might take you 8, 10, 12 hours to read. So it was clearly, you know, an opportunity for me to be more focused and just focus on what stories you need to tell, what are the most important stories, and not focus on how to craft them. Because the truth is, what story you tell is far more important than how you tell it. And I say that as somebody who professionally spends most of my time teaching people how to tell better stories. But honestly, the most credible and effective leaders that I work with, that's never the first question they ask. The first question they ask is, what stories do I need to tell? You know, if you deliver the right story at the right time to the right audience, even if you don't make the right eye contact, you kind of stutter and stammer your way through the story, you didn't think the story through very well, it was a little bit too long, you don't know what to do with your hands, you know, all that kind of stuff, your audience will forgive you. And they'll forgive you because you're probably not a professional speaker or actor. But if you deliver the wrong story at the wrong time, that's a boring, irrelevant story, but you deliver it in a way that would make a Shakespearean actor proud, your audience will never forgive you for wasting their time. Right? So literally the story is more important than the delivery. So that's what led me to think about what are the most important stories for a leader to tell. And of course, I picked 10 just because that's a nice big round number, that there's no other magic to it than that. But it's a smaller number than 70, and that's why 10 is the number. But I wanted to share with you how I went about trying to figure out what are the most important 10 stories that I think a leader ought to be able to tell after having spent the last 9 years, really, almost a decade in doing research on storytelling. And I've interviewed over 300 CEOs, leaders, executives, salespeople, marketers, engineers in dozens of industries and 25 countries around the world. And I don't mean like some impersonal surveys I'm sending out. I'm talking about one-on-one, face-to-face, hour or 2 hour long interviews. And each of these interviews, I'm getting 8 to 10 to 12 different stories, say, from these executives. So if you do the math, I've literally documented over 3,000 individual stories. And that, of course, has allowed me to reverse engineer my way into what works and what doesn't. But it's also where I learned the incredible diversity of stories that leaders are telling. And so I spent the last 7 years coaching and training leaders on how to be better storytellers. So the way I went about picking the most important 10 is, first of all, I looked back at my 7 now years of working with executives on storytelling to what stories they asked me for help with. Right, so I could come into it with my opinion, but I wanted to look back and I literally counted up what stories did leaders come to me and ask for help with. So that was my first criteria. I wanted it to be a practical list that I knew that leaders wanted help with. The second criteria was I wanted it to reflect areas that you and I both know that leaders need to exert influence. There are some areas of business that the leadership doesn't need to exert kind of daily influence, and some areas that leaders clearly need to exert significant regular influence. And when you see the list, I think you'll see that reflected in there. Thirdly, I wanted stories that would be useful for people in all job functions, not just the story that the general manager tells or the CEO tells or the marketing director tells or the HR leader tells or the chief technologist tells, but literally stories that all functional leaders should be able to tell well. And then my last criteria was I wanted to focus on stories that wouldn't change very often, that you wouldn't need to change very often. In other words, stories you could tell over and over and over again for years, if not decades. All right, there are some stories that you'll tell it once or twice, and then you'll never need to tell it again because the need has changed or the need is gone. But your company founding story, well, that's just never going to change, right? The company usually only gets founded once. Or your vision story, yeah, your vision might change every 5 or 6 years, but it's not going to change every 3 months. So your vision story shouldn't change every 3 months. So I picked stories that I thought would last you a long time so that you could invest the right time in getting them right. So those are the criteria I used, and you could probably add some more criteria to it, but I think you'll find that's a reasonable set of analytical tools to go about finding the most important stories that leaders ought to be telling. All right, so let's get into what they are, and then I'm going to give you a few examples, and then I'll give you a couple of tips on how to craft these stories, and then we'll open it to Q&A. So of the 10 stories, the first 4 go together because they're about setting direction for the organization. So here they are: where we came from, so that's our founding story; why we can't stay there, so that's a case for change story; where we're going, which is a vision story; and how we're going to get there, which I call a strategy story, because obviously a strategy is about how to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So I hope that you can see just from those first 4 that if you can tell those 4 stories in a compelling manner, you're far more likely to get the organization to go wherever it is that you want them to go, because you can clearly articulate where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. All right, those I think are the essence of setting direction for the organization, which is clearly a leader's job. All right, so the next 4 go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So that's what we believe. That's a corporate values story, values or ethics story. Who we serve, that's a customer story, a story about the customer you serve that you tell around the office so everybody has a visceral understanding of who your customer is. what we do for our customers. So I call that's like a classical sales story or a customer success story, a story about what you've done for your customers that's so awesome that other people ought to pay you money to do it. And then 8 is how we're different from our competitors. And I call that a marketing story because in my experience, a large part of marketing's job is to differentiate you from your competitors. So those 4 kind of go together as well, again, because they're more about who we are as an organization. So think about that. If you can tell these 4 stories well, you can articulate who you are as an organization, who you serve, what you do for those customers, and how you're different from your competitors. And again, I think every functional leader needs to be able to tell these stories. If you're the sales leader, of course you need to tell the sales story, but you probably have dozens of other sales stories that you need to be able to tell as well. But if you're the head of engineering, or if you're just an engineer in the company, you need to be able to tell one good sales story at a minimum. And it's not just the marketing team that needs to be able to tell the marketing story. They've probably got dozens of marketing stories that they can tell. But if you're the HR leader, you probably need to be able to tell at least one, the biggest, most important, compelling one. All right. So these are the most important individual stories I think leaders across every function need to be able to tell. Okay, so there are 2 more, and they kind of go together as well, but they're more about who you are as the leader. So that's why I lead the way I do. That's a personal leadership philosophy story, and why you should want to work here. So that's a recruiting story, and the you here is obviously whoever you're talking to. All right. And I call that a recruiting story, but obviously that's not just the job of the recruiting department or the HR department. Every leader's job is to bring in smart, talented people into the organization and to get them to stay and follow the leadership there, especially your leadership, right? So you need to be able to tell these 2 stories, no matter what job function you're in. So those are the top 10. There are probably you could add to that list or subtract from it, but I think most of you should be feeling right now, yeah, that's a reasonable list of the most important stories that I think leaders ought to be able to tell. And so what I want to do here is I want to share, I think I've got time to share maybe 3 of them with you, and then we'll cover some other basics of how to do storytelling, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. But I want to give you a feel for how these stories sound. So I want to start with number 5, which is what we believe, a corporate values story. And actually, I actually heard this story from the first time from John Pepper as I was interviewing him for my first book. And it's actually a story about Sam Walton. And so Mr. Pepper heard it no, it wasn't from Sam Walton, it was from Charles Butt, who at the time was the CEO of H-E-B grocery stores in Texas. So Charles Butt is the grandson of the founder of H-E-B, and at the time was the CEO of H-E-B. Now, for those of you that not from North America, H-E-B is a grocery retailer chain predominant in the state of Texas in the U.S. and for several decades was the largest retailer in the state of Texas until, of course, the mid 80s or so when Walmart had started to become a large regional player. Before it became the largest retailer probably in the world now. But at the time, around the mid 80s is about the time where Walmart took over in the state of Texas as being the largest grocery retailer. Well, at that time of Charles Butt apparently called Sam Walton on the phone in Bentonville, Arkansas, and said something like the following. First of all, Sam, congratulations. You're now the largest retailer in Texas, and my company's has had that honor for the last 40 or 50 years. So congratulations. And secondly, he said, I'd love to figure out how you did it. You're doing something right, and I'd love to come and bring my leadership team to your headquarters in Bentonville and just on a learning mission and learn how you're doing what you're doing because you're doing something really well. Now, obviously, Sam would have been well within his rights to tell Charles Butt to just buzz off, right? Like, we're competitors. I'm not going to teach you how we're doing what we're doing that's beating you. But that's not what he said, apparently. What he said was something like, well, I don't know what I can teach you, but I'll be happy to try. So they literally made an appointment for the leadership team of H-E-B to fly to Arkansas and meet Sam in Bentonville at one of his local stores. So on the appointed day at the appointed hour, here comes this gaggle of executives in business suits into this, Walmart store in Bentonville, Arkansas that they'd flown hundreds of miles to get to. They start walking through the store looking for Sam Walton. and they're looking down the aisles, and they finally spot him at the end of one of these aisles. So they turn up the aisle and start marching up the aisle, and he's at the end of the aisle talking to this young woman, and he's trying to sell her an ironing board cover. So he's literally in a conversation with her about all of the different brands and different sizes and different color patterns and features and benefits and prices and all this. And so Sam Walton sees Charles and all these executives marching up the aisle, and he holds his hand up and he stops him and he says, "Charles, I'll be with you in just a minute. I'm talking to this young woman." And as they're waiting, he finishes his conversation with her about all the different options, and she finally chooses one and puts it in her cart and shoves off to the register. Now, at that point, Sam turns to Charles and says, "Charles," and he's very excited when he says it. He says, "Charles, do you know how many worn out ironing board covers there are in this country? We're going to sell 1 million of them this month." Now, what can I tell you about how to run a retail store? And that's kind of the end of the story, because that's basically all you need to hear to know a lot about what Sam Walton values and what Walmart values. Now, when I teach my courses in front of a live audience who can talk back to me, which I understand you're unable to do right now, I ask them this question: what values do you see in this this story? Now, I think if I'd thought ahead of this, I would have given you the opportunity to type in a bunch of answers, but I forgot to do that. So I'm just going to tell you what most of my audiences respond. And you're probably thinking to yourself, what values do you see in this story play out? And here that I always get a dozen or so answers. Here are the kind of the top 5. First of all, other retailers are our competitors, but not our enemies, right? We're in the same industry, serving the same customer. All right. So that's very different than, hey, we're competitors, buzz off. Secondly, and this is probably the easiest one for you to spot, and maybe the most important one to Sam Walton, but the customer is number one, right? While there were the CEO and several executives from a company whom he'd invited, by the way, to fly hundreds of miles to come visit him in that store at that time, he made them wait while he spent time with the customer until she was satisfied, right? The customer is number one. Third, the importance of understanding customers' needs and wants. How did Sam Walton know that there were so many worn out ironing board covers in the country? I mean, this is the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. This is one tiny little SKU. How did he know? And the answer is because he asked. He cared. It was important to him to find out. All right, fourth, persistence. Notice he didn't give up until she was satisfied with her choice, put it in the buggy, and shoved off to the register. And he didn't give up just because he had some people show up. Now, fifth, a passion for winning. Do you see how excited he was that he was going to sell 1 million ironing board covers this year? You know, or this month. That kind of passion for winning from the boss is contagious, right? And it becomes pervasive throughout the entire organization if you just see it. So now there are probably a dozen others you could come up with, but the point is this one story. Imagine you were a new hire at Walmart, and they gave you a list of the company values, called the company value statement that every company has. P&G's got one, everybody's got one. And that's the kind of thing that goes into a file drawer somewhere that you'll never see again. But imagine instead if they had told you that story on your first day working at Walmart. You'd really know what it meant that the customer was number one. You'd know what it meant that the understanding the customer's needs is important. You'd know what it meant that a passion for winning is part of their culture. So a story like this is far better at informing people what the company values are than simply a value statement. What you need is a values story, right? And probably several of them. Now, this is one story that happens to articulate multiple values, but you might need, 3 or 4 different stories to articulate the 10 company values. You probably don't need 10, but you might need 2 or 3. So choose them wisely and use them. All right, so that's number 5. Let me skip to number 8, which is a how we're different from our competitors story, or in other words, a marketing story. Now, my example here comes from a guy named Sherrod Madison, who's the CEO of United Building Maintenance. So that's a commercial cleaning company. So these are the folks that come into your offices at night and clean it up. Now, when he is calling on a new prospect, of course, he's got a typical sales pitch, and he's probably got a sales manager with him. but I'm sure he goes through the sales pitch, but he almost always tells a personal story about what he does when he gets a new client. He basically tells them, look, every time I get a new client, there's a 30-day transition period while the old company's kind of winding down. And at the end of 30 days, my company's going to take over. And during that 30 days, I always kind of do the same thing. I sneak into the building in the middle of the night and I watch how they're cleaning the building. Now, it's not as nefarious as I probably just made it sound because he gets permission to do this. But the point is, he wants to go see how they're cleaning the building today because typically the employees that are cleaning the building are contract employees, and he's going to inherit them at the end of the month. So he wants to see if they're doing their job well, if they're properly trained and equipped to succeed. So he said, so, last month we took over the Verizon building in New Jersey, and I, 2 o'clock in the morning, I go in there and I see this guy vacuuming the carpets, and he's using the same kind of vacuum cleaner that I use at home, the same, residential quality vacuum cleaner. Now, those corridors are 12 feet wide and it's a half a mile around in total. He said it's going to take that guy a month just to vacuum the carpets once. And by the way, it's not going to do a good job, and that vacuum cleaner is going to break down every couple of weeks because it's just not made for that kind of volume of usage. So when we took over, we put him into an industrial grade, triple wide vacuum cleaner that'll do the job in a fraction of the time, do a much better job, and that thing's going to last forever. All right. He said, I went to another floor and I saw somebody shampooing the carpets, and it was kind of the same story. He was using the same kind of squeeze bottle, walk behind shampooer that I use at home. And it's the same problem, right? It's just not going to do a good job. It's going to break down. So when we took over, we put him into a commercial grade riding shampooer. And he said that thing will do the job in also a fraction of the time, does a much better job. But notice what else it does. It gets the guy off his feet, right? And so that means I have fewer workman's comp issues, which means my client has fewer workman's comp issues. But the last thing I wanted to check, I wanted to see how they were dusting the offices. So I went and found one of the offices and looked on top of the file cabinets. And I saw the same thing on top of every file cabinet. There was a half of a moon swiped out on top. And I said, I know exactly what that means, and you probably do too. The half a moon happens not because the people who are dusting it are lazy. It's because those cabinets are standard 5.5 feet tall. Some of the people cleaning cabinets are less than that tall. So it's not that they're lazy. They're just literally not tall enough to reach the back of the 5.5 foot tall, 3 foot deep cabinet. And that's what leaves that little half moon swiped out on top. And he said the truth is they'd be better off not dusting the top at all because it's the contrast between the dirty part and the clean part that makes it obvious that it's not been cleaned properly. He said, so when we took over, we just gave everybody these little 18-inch plastic extension wands so they could reach the back of the cabinets with their dust cloths, problem solved. So, just in that little story, notice that he's articulated what his key differentiating characteristics are, the key benefits and features that are different about him versus his competitors. But he's done it in a way that's far more compelling than saying what he could have said instead. If he was just in typical feature benefit pitch mode, he could have said, look, the reason why we're better than our competitors is we use triple wide industrial grade vacuum cleaners. We use commercial grade riding shampooers, and I give all my cleaners 18-inch extension wands for the dust cloths. And that's why we're better. Now, I mean, that would be the same set of facts basically, but the story he told allows the audience to see in their mind's eye, that guy riding around on that vacuuming machine like the Zamboni driver at the ice skating rink, right? I mean, you can see somebody easily reaching the back of the cabinets with their dust cloths. It leaves a permanent mental image in their mind as they can see the benefits in use in the movie that's playing out in their mind, as opposed to just being given a list. So that I call a marketing story, not a sales pitch or a key, features and benefits, which you need those things, but it's far better if you articulate them in the form of a story. All right, and that's the kind of story anybody could tell in the office, right? All right, so let's go to number 9. So this is a why I lead the way I do story. So this is a personal leadership philosophy story. So the example I want to share with you here comes from a guy named Mike Figliolo, and his first leadership opportunity was in the Army. So he's a West Point grad of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So he graduates, and his first job is he's leading a platoon of tanks. Okay, so he's the guy in the middle there, sitting on the cannon turret there of the tank. So in one of his first leadership opportunities is at a training exercise out in California. So this is not real combat, but it's simulated combat, but with real tanks. But instead of shooting real ordnances at each other, they're just basically firing little lasers that'll register on some kind of a device. So basically, it's a giant game of laser tags, but with real tanks. So in this exercise, there were literally 400 tanks on the left side of the battlefield, which was a 10-mile long, 5-mile wide real training field, and 400 tanks on the other side. Well, it turned out Mike was assigned to be the platoon leader for the first tank that was going to go out into battle on his side of the field. So there'd be 400 other tanks behind him. So of course, the night before the simulation, he sits down with a commanding officer and goes through the battle plan and the map of the terrain and figures out where the high ground is and what the right strategy would be to get the high ground and win the exercise. So the next morning, the exercise starts, and he's in that first tank, and they take off out onto the field at top speed, which is somewhere around 40 miles an hour. And he gets 2 or 3 minutes into this exercise, and gets to the place where he's got to make his first decision of whether to turn right or left, and he doesn't know what to do. Right? Apparently, looking at a battlefield through the crack in the hatch of a tank going 40 miles an hour and getting shot at is a little bit different than it looks like in a map, on a map in a conference room under lights. So he's just not clear what to do. So he had a choice to make. He could either stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, figure out what the right thing to do is, and then do it, which might take, 30 seconds, or he could just make a guess, an educated guess, but a guess. So Mike chose option 2. He yells out, "Driver, turn left," in the most authoritative voice that he could, even though he knew he had no idea if that was the right thing to do or not. So the driver turns left. Well, 30 seconds after that turn, the light on top of his tank starts to siren and go off, which means you just got shot by a laser, you're dead. So he has to stop the tank, pop the hatch. He and his guys get out. They're done for the day. Well, of course, a few seconds later, the second tank is following him, turns left, and a few seconds after that, their light goes off, they're dead. Well, tank number 3, of course, turns left also, and their light goes off, they're dead. But tank number 4 saw 3 tanks turn left and get shot and virtually killed. So tank number 4 realized that was a mistake. So tank number 4 turned right, and then 396 other tanks turned right. Those 396 tanks took the high ground and won the exercise, right? Now, Mike made a mistake in that exercise, but he learned something about good leadership in it. And what he learned was sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than to make the right decision fast. Because imagine if he had chosen option 2 and stopped the tank and turned the light on and got the map out, there would have been 400 tanks on his side of the field stopped, waiting for him to make a decision, and they'd be sitting ducks for the competition. Better for him to turn left and find out. And it turns out in the military and in life and in business, often your mistakes will get surfaced to you pretty quickly, right? And usually they're not life-threatening mistakes, especially in the business world. They're recoverable mistakes. So sometimes it's better to go ahead and make the right decision quickly than to go through the analysis paralysis that you and I both know we often are famous for at P&G, is just taking way too much time and doing too much analysis before making a decision. Sometimes make the best decision you can, monitor and adjust quickly. Now, Mike tells that story now to people he works with for this reason. He wants them to understand why he makes the decisions the way he makes decisions. He's a quick decision maker today, but he also and he expects that of other people as well. But he also is very forgiving and has a high level of tolerance for mistakes as long as you learn from them. So he could tell you, in fact, you all know this. Everybody on this call, since you worked at P&G, at some point in your career, you met somebody for the first time at P&G and they handed you a piece of paper and it said something at the top like my leadership principles or my operating principles. And it was a bunch of buzzwords about value added activities and customer focus and a bunch of other things. And it was a litany of bullet points. And you've probably gotten dozens of them over the course of your career. And the truth is, you could probably switch the names out of the top of each of those pages and it wouldn't have made any difference because none of them were very original and they didn't tell you much about the person. A story like this does that far better because the story lets you know when he says, I'm a decisive leader and I expect you to be decisive, and but I forgive you if you learn from your mistakes. Well, what does that really mean? You need an example of that to know what he means by that. And so a story like that helps illustrate why you've become the leader that you are today. Why is it that you lead the way you do? And people will remember that story far longer, and it will have a bigger impact on what they think of you and how they expect you to lead than that list of buzzwords that you gave them when you first met that they probably never thought of after that. Right. So now you probably need, 2 or 3 stories like that to fully articulate why you become the leader you've become. But that's the kind of story that I think every leader needs to be able to tell about themselves. All right. So let's do this. Um, Let me shift now. So there are 7 other stories in the book that 10 stories great leaders tell, but those are 3 of them. I think you get the idea for them. Let me switch now to how can you find these stories yourself? Because obviously these stories are about somebody else. So you need your own stories like this. So here's my advice. First of all, make a wish list. And in fact, that's the purpose of these 10 stories is if you're going to make a list of the stories you need, these would be the first 10 you should put on your list. But you probably need more. But start with a list of them, and prioritize them. I really wish I had a why I lead the way I do story. I really wish I had a vision story or a strategy story. Make a list and prioritize them. Secondly, search your past. You've probably had an experience in the past that will help you craft a story around this thing. But you don't have to limit yourself to your own experiences, because that's number 3 here is ask for them. Share your list with other people and tell them, I'm looking for a story like this. Do you have one that can help us as a team, as a company, as a brand, accomplish what we're trying to accomplish? Here's an example. Do we have something like that? Okay. Fourth, invite everyone in your organization to share more stories. In fact, some of my best clients create story circles. So that, for example, once a month, 30 people kind of at random get picked to attend the monthly story circle. And they come to the room, and you've probably ordered pizza ahead of time. And the only thing they're allowed to do for the whole hour is eat and tell stories. Nothing else. No checking email, no, whatever. Just eat and tell stories. And the stories that they're supposed to bring a story. And so you'll have 30 people in the room. You have 30 different stories by the time the hour's done. Right. Weekly team meetings. So some of my better clients make it a requirement in each of their leadership team or their weekly staff meetings that one person has to tell a new story. And you know ahead of time who it is. So this week it's my week, next week it's your week, next week it's Sally's week, then it's Bob's week. So you know when it's your week, and you have to bring an interesting story, a leadership story, a marketing story, a sales story, whatever. So by the end of the year, you've got 52 interesting stories that everybody in the team now has those stories added to their repertoire. All right. And then last, and P&G's actually done this, hold a contest, right? I mean, put on your internal company, website, we're holding a contest for the best stories, the best videos. Film yourself telling a story, submit it. We'll have people vote on it, and then we'll, announce the winners. That's a great way to get more stories added to your repertoire. So a lot of creative ways to do that. All right. Let's move on to one other tip, and that is, okay, so I said I wasn't going to talk too much about how to craft these stories, but I will leave you with a little bit of advice, and that is that good stories do have a structure, all right? And there are all kinds of different structures that I've studied as part of figuring out how to do stories right, and there are really long ones. Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey storytelling structure that's got 17 plot structure points and a dozen other different places, different points. Here's what I found works best. If you will answer these 8 questions in this order about the thing that happened that you want to tell someone about, your story will already be in the right order, right? And now you need to create some emotional engagement. It'd be nice if you had a surprise ending, and around time to get into all of that. But at a minimum, have your stories fit the right structure. So here are those 8 questions. First of all, why should I listen to your story? I, the person listening, you got to give your audience a reason to listen to your story in the first 10 or 15 seconds, or they might not. Tell them what's in it for them. If you listen to me share the story, this will happen. You'll be better at this. I'm telling you this because. Give them a reason to listen to your story. Once you've done that, you've kind of earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. Where and when did it happen? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? what did they do about it, and how did it turn out in the end? Right? That should sound like the natural flow of a story, and it is. But if you don't tell it in the right order, it won't work as well, because the human brain is for some reason wired to want to know where and when something happened before they find out what happened. Right? And that kind of gives the story credibility. Oh, if you know where and when it happened, it must be a true story. And also, you don't want to tell, how it turned out in the end at the beginning, which, by the way, we're often taught in our memo writing. Put the end right at the beginning. Here's what I recommend. When you're making a recommendation or giving a presentation or writing a memo, well, of course you should do it that way. But when you're pausing during a presentation or in the middle of an email or a conversation to tell a story, you don't do it that way. You don't tell the end of a story at the beginning. That's not how stories work. The end of the story goes at the end, not at the beginning. So don't give away the lesson or the action or how the story turned out in the end. Those all three go at the end. In fact, that leads me to the last two questions. Once you finish telling the story, is you need to make sure your audience knows what they were supposed to learn from it and what they should go do now. Right? That's your opportunity to make a recommendation. So let me pause there for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any that you've got, and we'll wrap up however we need to do on this webinar.
Super. Thank you so much, Paul. I am going to take the ball back now. And so I'm going to ask folks, if you have questions, go ahead and put your questions in. And what we're going to do is, if I can get my screen to work right, we're going to go ahead and address as many of the questions as we possibly can. Paul, I have to say, I love your book, and it just sort of simplifies things in a way that, for me, is like, sometimes we have this convoluted idea of all these stories and all that, but you break it down into pieces that really make a lot of sense. And it occurs to me also that whether you tell a vision story or a strategy story or a value story, people have their own stories that they're making up anyway. So you might as well tell the story that you want them to have, right?
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, I'm often asked, how do you get rid of bad stories that are kind of trafficking around the organization? And the answer is the only way to get rid of a bad story is to replace it with a good story. Which is what you said. People are already telling stories. You can't tell people stop telling that story. But if they're telling a bad company value story, replace it with a better company value story, and that will be the thing that people are talking about instead of the old one.
That is such a great point. Some organizations that I've been a part of, there have been so many toxic stories that circulated around, but after a while, they were replaced with some really great stories.
Right.
So again, a wonderful presentation here, and even the book. I would recommend it to everybody. But one question for you: which of these 10 stories, in your experience, are leaders actually best at telling already?
Yeah, so probably the founding story is the one that most leaders already know. I mean, most people know how their company got founded, and they're not always great at telling it, but at least they know they know the basics of the story. Whereas there's some others on this list that some leaders don't even have a clue where they would start on the story.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And which one of these are the hardest to pull off? I mean, what's been your experience?
Yeah, so the sales and marketing ones are typically not too difficult, because you got whole departments of people working on things like that to draw from. But probably the vision story is pretty hard, and the reason is most leaders have a vision, or what they have is a vision statement. We want to be the fastest growing restaurant chain on the East Coast, or we want to develop the world's quietest jet engine. And and I mean, that's a nice goal. Yeah, I'd call that more of a goal than a vision. But even if it was fleshed out into a little bit more of a vision, it's a vision statement, not a vision story. And most leaders don't even it's never even occurred to them that they need a story to accompany their vision statement, right? So you can have a vision statement that's probably a single paragraph, but a vision story is more of, it's a story about the future and what it's going to be like to work at your company once you've accomplished that vision. how's it going to be different? Or is it going to be more fun to work there? Are you all going to make more money? Is it going to be, they're going to be more challenging jobs? Is your workday going to be more rewarding? You're telling a story about the future that's so compelling that people want to help you get there. But it's a story about the future, not simply a statement or a sentence. And in my experience, most companies don't have anything like that.
Got it. Okay. So we've had some questions come in. One question is, how would you translate these tips to the nonprofit sector where leaders are trying to motivate communities to change how they operate?
So, great question. Some of them obviously will translate quite uh, readily, like our the founding story, the why we can't stay there. That I call the case for change story. All nonprofits have a case for change as well, right? They're in business for a reason. They're trying to affect some kind of good change in the world, so they definitely ought to have one of those. In fact, the example in the book in chapter 2 for case for change story is from the nonprofit sector. Um, Nonprofits ought to have a vision story as well. They ought to have a strategy story. They ought to have a values story. The customer story might be a little bit different because they might think of their customers not as customers that they're getting money from, but a benefactor or an audience that is benefiting from it. But you still need to know who that is. I mean, this is where you think in terms of like a CMK. You've done some research and you need to understand who the person is you're trying to benefit. The marketing story might be one that's radically different for a nonprofit because you're not as much selling a product, but you still need to get people to give you their money, which so
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely a story there. So I would say almost all of these really translate quite well to the nonprofit sector.
Got it. Yeah, the principles apply. Very good. So another question, how many or what percentage of your 3,000 interviews were from women? The person asks, my experience as a woman is a bit counter to what you've shared because when I tell stories, I've gotten feedback that I have too many stories and they only wanted bullet points because they didn't want to work to figure me out. So what is your experience with that?
Yeah, so I'll go out on a limb here, and I'll guess that kind of feedback probably came from a man. So
Hmm.
give me more bullet points and tell me fewer stories. Now that's just a guess,
Hmm.
but I would say 40 to 50% of the people that I interviewed were women, but none of it wasn't like men, it's not like men are asking for stories and women are not. In fact, my gut tells me it would be a little bit closer to the opposite. But in general, most people I think will tell you at work that they don't want to hear stories. And so they tell you exactly the experience that the person that asked that question has had is what most people have. In fact, here's the analogy I would use. Telling a grown-up that you want to tell them a story at work when you're in the middle of a meeting or a phone call or something like that is a bit like telling a 5-year-old kid it's time to stop playing and it's time to come in and take a bath, right? In both cases, they don't want to do it, right? They're enjoying what they're doing at the moment. They don't want to stop and go do something different. But in both cases, once they're in it, they don't want to get out, right? The kid doesn't want to get out of the bath because they're having fun. And once you start telling a story, if you do it well, people love it. Now, my guess is when you get feedback like, don't tell me a story, just give me the bullet points, there are two things going on there. First of all, I don't think you should spend all day long telling stories. In fact, I'd put a number to it. I think only 10 to 15% of the time when you're having a conversation at work or making a presentation or writing a memo, you should be sharing a story. So 85 to 90% of the time, you should just be giving people the bullet points or answering their question, directly and straightforward without a story. So when you get that feedback, just follow it. Oh, okay, you're not interested in a story right now. But 10 to 15% of the time, you probably should. And if the 10 to 15% of the time you still get that feedback, that tells me you're not telling the story very well. When you tell a good story, people will want to hear it, but not all day long. If you walked around telling stories all day long, of course, that would get really tiresome. It also tells me that, if you're 15 minutes into a 4-minute story, that's a problem. People are going to tell you can you just stop and cut to the chase? These stories should be 2 or 3 minutes long, right? There's not enough time for somebody to get tired and bored with the story. So I don't see a lot of gender differences in the stories that people tell, the stories that people appreciate, the way that they should be crafted for maximum effectiveness. So I've just not noticed a big gender difference.
Got it. And so that sort of leads to another question that was asked when you talk about sort of not stretching this a 4-minute story to a 20-minute story. But the question is asked, well, how do you help people come up with the sort of the point or the moral of the story so they can tell the story and get to the point, get to that moral?
Yeah, so, well, you need to start with it is the main, not start telling it, but in order to choose the right story to tell, you need to know what your objective is in telling the story. You're not just telling stories to entertain people. This isn't like just water cooler chat to, break the ice at the office, although I suppose it can be used for that purpose too. But when you're telling a real leadership or sales or marketing story, you're doing it for a reason. So the first two questions you ask yourself are, who's my audience? And what do I want them to think, feel, or do after hearing the story that they weren't going to do otherwise? And only once you've answered those two questions to yourself in your mind, are you ready to choose the right story to tell? Because until you know who your audience is and what you want them to go do, how on earth could you pick the right story to tell? So knowing what your objective is and the lesson you want them to learn, you'll choose the story that will teach that lesson, and then probably they'll learn it just as you're telling the story. If they don't, if you get the impression at the end that they didn't get it, well, then that's when you answer questions 7 or 8, which is what should you have learned from the story and what should you go do now? But if you did a good job, a halfway decent job of choosing the right story and telling it decently, they will have already learned the right lesson and they'll go do what you want them to do.
Fantastic. We've got time for a couple of more questions. The next question is, in your experience, are the best company stories strictly true and factual?
Yes. Yes, I believe they are. In fact, in my experience, about 95% of the time, I'm able to find a true and factual story to tell in the right moment. There is a 5% of the time that I'm unable to find the right details, the right facts of something that happened. And so I end up telling a fictionalized story or a fictional story. But the key thing to know there are two things. One is it's okay to tell a fictional story every once in a while. But it should be the minority of the time. Most of the time, you should be telling stories about real things that happen to real people. But the second thing is, when you do tell a fictional story, it's very important that your audience know that it's a fictional story. You don't want, to tell a fictional story and have your audience assume or believe that it's a true story, because now you've just lied to them, right? And that never ends very well in the business world or in life. So if you're going to tell a fictionalized story, just let your audience know that it's this is kind of company lore or I typically will start it out like, okay, imagine this, right? Now you've told them in those first two words, okay, I'm kind of making this up, but go with me because I think it will help you understand the point that I'm trying to make. I'm going to share, a fictionalized account of the kind of thing that I know happens all the time, but I don't have a lot of the data with me right now, but just kind of go with me on this.
Yeah, I think my experience with that has been really great. At the beginning of any talk that I give personally, I always tell people, I say, I'm going to tell you a lot of stories. Some of them are true and some of them are not. And when they're not, I'm going to tell you that they're not. And people get a chuckle out of it and they're kind of ready for something like that. So Paul, one other question. Which story category, if any, do you think is most important?
So I think the answer, the way I'd respond to that is there's not one most important story. It was hard enough to come up with 10, only 10, right? Remember, I started with 70 and I got it down to 10. So I think to tell you that, one of these stories is more important than all the others would be doing you a disservice. What I suggest you do is look at these 10 and ask yourself, in my business, in my job, in my career, in the situation I'm in this week, which of these stories is the most important for me to tell today or tomorrow? And then what's the second most important? Or ask yourself again next week, and the answer might be different. But I say that because a lot of people contact me and say, hey, we need you to help us tell our corporate story. Well, what corporate story would that be? And I dig into it a little bit, and well, there's like a half a dozen different stories in there, right? A single story is a single story, not everything anybody ever needs to know about my company, what we do, why we do it, how we make our product, how we service. Like I want it all in there. Well, that's not a story. That's a marketing campaign. and your marketing campaign could have 7 different, communication points and 7 different stories to articulate those. So yeah, I don't think I'd pick one. I think you need to pick one.
Excellent. And you do mention this, I know in the appendix of your book, you also you have a tool there for folks to sort of prioritize these different stories and determine who to tell it to, and so on and so forth. So that is there as well. So that's all the questions that we have time for at this point. But I want to thank you again, Paul. We've got a few announcements I want to make, and then we're going to go ahead and conclude the webinar. So once again, these webinars are recorded, and you can view them on our YouTube channel. Keep in mind that this, again, there are all the past webinars, with the exception of 1 or 2 that were kind of time sensitive, are there for your viewing pleasure. And while you're there, please do go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You can sign up for updates at pgalums.com, support the foundation, pgalumnifoundation.com, partner with us at pgalums.com/sponsor, and you can volunteer, start a chapter, join a chapter, so you can send us an email at hello@pgalums.com. And we will get back to you with any questions that you might have. And so here again, the YouTube channel is on your screen, where you can view these webinars and also subscribe. So our next webinar is on February 11th. It is titled "Retirement: Think Beyond the Money" by Patricia Doyle. We would encourage you to sign up and participate in that. And this is Amir Ganad, your host. I'm signing off for the next few months, as Eliana Rojas is going to take over as the MC for these Enrichment Series webinars. And I will be back with you in a few months. Until then, I hope that you will boldly declare, courageously pursue, and abundantly achieve the extraordinary. And thanks for joining us.